Hello everyone, and today we'll be going over Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Chapter 10, entitled The Classless Society. Now this is the first chapter in the section on totalitarianism, so we finally got there. Now, in order for totalitarian movements to be successful and for them to evolve into totalitarian regimes, they need support from a population that represents a majority of the people. And totalitarian movements recruit from this population that Arendt calls the classless society, which she also calls the masses. Now, who are the masses? Well, according to Arendt, the masses are those people who are apolitical, that they haven't voted in elections, they haven't taken a stance on public affairs, they live their own private lives outside the public sphere. It's not until after World War I, where an anti-democratic, pro-dictatorial wave sweeps Europe, that these masses start gaining an appetite for political affairs. Now, it's important to note that this group isn't like a political party that has common interests that rallies its people around a common interest, but instead, these people don't have a common interest. They only unify around the idea of being a part of a movement that wants change. What unites them is the need to move, to not be bored, to not have time and sit down and think about the desperation of their lives, but to be deeply and constantly excited. They feel like what they're doing is worth doing. They need a sense of meaning in this lonely world and disenchanted world that they feel like they are in. Now, we have to understand what time they're living in. This is the Great Depression, where there's high unemployment, there's high poverty, and the people really don't feel like the status quo is working for them. It is only in the atmosphere of a declining government and a disintegrating class society that the mass man psychology develops. According to Arendt, there's two major illusions in democratically held countries that let the mass man become who he becomes. The first illusion is that in democratically held countries, most citizens partake in political affairs. This is an illusion because if you look at the numbers in elections and polls, not a majority of people are actually contributing. The second illusion is that these people that don't get involved in politics are not political at all. They're apolitical and they don't care about anything. This is anything but the case that we see in the 1930s when the masses basically come up into the political affairs scene because they have been neglected for so long. In fact, when they come onto the political scene, they see the party system as something that is against them entirely, and thus they need to abolish parties altogether. Quote, they constantly preferred methods which ended in death rather than persuasion, which spelled terror rather than conviction. But this isn't a self-organizing concept. Instead, totalitarian movements acted as the organizing force for these masses. For example, Hitler evoked a fascination in these people. They saw him as a leader that they could stand by. Quote, this fascination, the strange magnetism that radiated from Hitler in such a compelling manner, rested indeed on a fanatical belief of this man in himself, on his pseudo-authoritative judgments about everything under the sun, and on the fact that his opinions could always be fitted into an all-encompassing ideology. That when these people come to see Hitler speak, they're not trying to understand the world through his content of the speech, but the way he gives it. That he has a strong conviction, that he has a firm voice, and that anything that he says must be true. Hitler with his strong conviction also didn't really work well with the current trend in modern times where people don't really have a discerning judgment. When someone says something that they're strongly opinionated on, we rather shy away and not put our own personal judgments on the issue in order to get away from any sort of violence. Instead, if someone did have a voice, if someone did have an unshakable conviction, then that was being seen as having some sort of good character. Thus, for people who are not willing to make their own discerning judgments, to have someone give their values to them through unshakable convictions and a firm voice was something that they actually enjoyed. But the problem lies in that having an unshakable conviction is independent from what that conviction is. Now, as long as you say something with a strong voice and people believe it, is different than what they're actually trying to say. And this is where the problem comes with Hitler, because what he was talking about was committing crimes against anybody who was against the movement. And as we get later into the future of the Nazi movement, he starts committing crimes against its own people. Quote, he may even be willing to help in his own prosecution and frame his own death sentence if only his status as a member of the movement is not touched. Thus, everything that mattered was only about being loyal and have a dignity towards the movement, even if it meant basically sacrificing yourself. Now, why did they give so much up for the movement? What was in the movement other than the fascination that really made them believe and want to sacrifice themselves? Well, according to Arendt, it's a sign of the times. People during this time were somewhat bored and fed up with the bourgeois society of fake culture. They wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves. And the movement provided that. It let them be the cogs in the wheel of history and time. In this world of being a part of the movement, everybody is just a pawn. It's the Great Equalizer. Everybody is on the same footing, basically achieving greatness and excellence. But since everybody's also equal, no one is immune, and anybody can be replaced, even the leaders. In effect, being a part of the movement meant total conformity to the movement. That everything that was of value to the movement had nothing to do with experience in the world. It wasn't conditioned on any experiences you had in the world. Instead, it was conditioned on the will and the spirit of the people in the movement. And it's this reason why Arendt says that totalitarian movements aren't idealisms. An idealism requires an individual to have a strong belief that is conditioned by his experiences in the world. Totalitarian movements, however, require masses that lose themselves in the movement, who are not the agent in giving that strong conviction. Instead, they lose themselves and give themselves up, and everything that happens that is experienced in the world has nothing to do with their experiences, but has to do with the convictions of the movement. As long as the leader stated it firmly enough and that the crowd yelled loud enough, then it was true. Quote, they presented disagreements as invariably originating in deep natural, social, or psychological sources beyond the control of the individual, and therefore beyond the power of reason. And when Himmler recruited from the masses to join the SS party, he knew this. He knew the psychology of these people. He knew that they weren't interested in everyday problems like political parties were. Instead, they were interested in things that thought in continents and centuries. They saw themselves as being a part of a movement that happened only once in 2,000 years. Now, if we look back at the imperialism part of this book, you can see a very similar idea with Cecil Rhodes, who wanted to annex the planets and wanted to create a secret society to be remembered for eternity. But there is a key difference between this imperialistic mindset and this new mass phenomenon. The old imperialism was popularized mostly by the bourgeoisie, who wanted to make money overseas in Africa, who required the government's help in order to secure their assets. In order for this to work, you need a strong man in power, a dictator who controls and pulls the levers. However, with the new mass phenomenon, there's not one person who's pulling the levers. There's nobody. There's no goal, there's no ambition. All that matters is being a part of the movement itself. And where that movement goes is under no one's discretion. Quote, in as far as individualism characterized the bourgeoisies, as well as the mob's attitude to life, totalitarian movements can rightly claim that they were in the first truly anti-bourgeois parties. They involved their members to the point of complete loss of individual claims and ambition. What mattered to the mass man was not any one single goal. It was about being a part of a movement that would change history. And this is what's particularly dangerous about totalitarian movements. The people who are a part of those movements aren't thinking about any end goals. What happens, happens. All they really care about is being a part of something that gives them meaning, being a part of a movement that is going to change the world. Quote, These people were transformed into one great unorganized, structureless mass of furious individuals who had nothing in common except their vague apprehension that the hopes of party members were doomed, that consequently the most respected, articulate, and representative members of the community were fools, and that all the powers that be were not so much evil as they were equally stupid and fraudulent. Again, one of the main factors of joining the movement in the first place is feeling like not being represented, feeling a loneliness of not being a part of any party, and thus resenting that party. Where parties organize around a single positive idea, masses unify around simply being a part of a movement that is doing things. And in this case, the doing things is destruction towards the party system. And during the Great Depression, during the advent of nihilism, there wasn't really any authority or traditional values that kept legitimacy amongst the people. And so Mass Man needed to find his own source of value, and that just happened to be totalitarian movements. And when one joins a totalitarian movement, he is a part of the masses who have a selfish respect of themselves. They see themselves as expendable. They see themselves as a cog in the wheel, someone who's just a pawn in the game. Quote, "The old adage that the poor and oppressed have nothing to lose but their chains no longer applied to the mass men, for they had lost much more than the chains of misery when they lost interest in their own well-being." Now, according to Arendt, scholars predicted the rise of mass man, but they didn't predict how it would happen, and they didn't see that it would unify around the concept of selflessness. The mass man unified or organized around the ideas of loss of self-interest, of bored indifference in the face of crime and death, of a passionate inclination towards abstract notions of life and contempt for any kind of rules or common sense. And it wasn't only the people who were in poverty that were attracted to the totalitarian movements. It was also the elites and the intellectuals who, trying to deal with nihilism and a lack of any traditional values, saw this new violence as a kind of value-laden activity. Now, according to Arendt, mass man is not characteristic as much of his brutality of violence as much as his isolation from social relationships. What mattered to mass man wasn't being a part of a community or family or having friends. What mattered was the movement, being a part of the movement. Since his only really primary relationship to life was being a part of the movement, there was no alternative value system to argue against the movement. And instead, if anything were to argue against the system, it would be immediately destroyed. In a way, only socially isolated humans can be loyal to a system, because if they have no other way of valuing things, then you know that they have no faculty for arguing against the system in the first place. Quote, "And total loyalty is possible only when fidelity is emptied of all concrete content, from which changes of mind might naturally arise." What's even more is that these totalitarian movements leading the mass people would change on a day-to-day basis. If you asked anybody in the street what was this all about, there wouldn't be some single kernel of truth that they've held onto for the last how many months or years. It was a day-to-day phenomenon. They'd have to look in the newspapers and see what Stalin said or what Hitler said, and that was what unified them. And in a sense, being a part of a movement became a lifestyle. You had to be up to date on what was going on in the movement. And if you weren't, then you didn't feel a part of it. Quote, "If totalitarianism takes its own claim seriously, it must come to the point where it has to finish once and for all with the neutrality of chess. That is, with the autonomous existence of any activity whatsoever. That even chess clubs, where you create a camaraderie with people who also play chess for the sake of chess, is a danger for totalitarian movements because it gives people a way to talk outside of the movement. That maybe one day your chess partner might have a thought against the movement and you would be able to sympathize with that. That was the possible destruction of the totalitarian movement. Quote, Hitler's rise to power was legal in terms of majority rule, and neither he nor Stalin could have maintained the leadership of large populations, survived many interior and exterior crises, and braved the numerous dangers of relentless inter-party struggles if they had not had the confidence in the masses. And in order to ensure confidence amongst the masses, they had to socially isolate them. It is this social atomization, this kind of destruction of social and family ties of people, that everything is seen through the dignity of the movement, and that is it. Quote, the consequence of the simple and ingenious device of guilt by association is that as soon as man is accused, his former friends are transformed immediately into his bitterest enemies. In order to save their own skins, they volunteer information and rush in with denunciations to corroborate the non-existent evidence against him. This is obviously the only way to prove their own trustworthiness. That if one day one of your friends is convicted or persecuted for being against the movement, and you were friends with them, if someone asked you why you were friends with them, the only way to really save yourself would say it was a pretext for spying on them in the first place. And this is where we come to a almost complete definition in Origins of Totalitarianism of what totalitarianism is, which is very rare in Arendt's writing. Quote, totalitarian movements are mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals. Again, they are movements, which means that they have no really end goal. Their organization is determined on always moving, always changing. That these movements organize masses of people who don't have any self-interest in their own, but only really care about belonging to something that is great. And that in order to keep loyalty amongst these people, totalitarian movements need to atomize them from all social ties. That their only tie to the world is membership of the movement. And it's also important to say that totalitarian movements aren't led by some dictator up there. I mean, sure, Hitler and Stalin could be seen as leaders that are pulling the strings in the background, but according to Arendt, that's not really the case. These totalitarian leaders weren't motivated by power. They were motivated by fame. They wanted to control as many people as possible. And in order to do this, they needed to listen to what the masses wanted. If the masses wanted the destruction of the party system, Hitler would give speeches about the destruction of the party system. And that would even rile up even more the crowd and want more destruction. And you can see how this keeps on snowballing. Hitler once said, all that you are through me. All that I am through you alone. In effect, there's no tyrant or dictator that's calling up all the actions to be had. It's a weird dialectic between the masses and these totalitarian leaders. Quote, the practical goal of the movement is to organize as many people as possible within its framework and to set and keep them in motion. A political goal that would constitute the end of the movement simply doesn't exist. According to Arendt, this is what separates the Nazis from other fascists. Fascists use totalitarian movements and the organize of the masses for an end goal, which is power of the state and control of the country. The Nazis didn't have any end goal. Their movement was always moving, was always seeking more and more power. Now, according to Arendt, what's disturbing about totalitarian movements, well, there's probably a lot of things, but one of the most pressing concerns she has is that it had not just an effect on the mob and the masses, is that the totalitarian movements also had an effect on the elites. And by understanding this connection to the elites, we can also understand how the mob was so attracted to totalitarian movements in the first place. Now, we have to make a distinction between the mob and the masses, because this is important in Arendt's lexicon. The mob was born out of the front generation, that generation that saw what was happening before World War I, lived through World War I, and is now in post-war. They saw the times of imperialism, when the mob was contradicting everything that was bourgeois. The mob was led by people who had failed in society. The mob was consistent of members who felt like they were left out of society, who didn't reap the benefits of the bourgeoisie, and thus felt like they were failures in a sense. Quote, the fact that their lives prior to their political careers had been failures, quote, the fact that their lives prior to their political careers had been failures was the strongest factor in their mass appeal. It seemed to prove that individually they embodied the mass destiny of the time and that their desire to sacrifice everything was the movement. Their assurance of devotion to those who had been struck by catastrophe, their determination never to be tempted back into the security of normal life, and their contempt for respectability were quite sincere and not just inspired by passing ambitions. The mob consisted of people who basically didn't like the status quo, who were affected by it, and who failed because of it, and they wanted to fight back against it. Now, the post-war elite that Arendt talks about, which makes up more of the masses, was not a part of this mob, but they had similar sentiments. Like Lawrence of Arabia, they sought something to lose themselves in, to find themselves in the stream of history and swim in the right direction. Quote, the front generation were completely absorbed by their desire to see the ruin of this whole world of fake security, fake culture, and fake life. Now, in this post-war era, according to Arendt, the student would say, what counts is always the readiness to make a sacrifice, not the object for which the sacrifice is made. The young worker says, it doesn't matter whether one lives a few years longer or not, one would like to have something to show for one's life. Quote, they cherished an experience which they thought might serve to separate them definitely from the hated surroundings of respectability. According to Arendt, the outbursts of nihilism in pre-war society was representative of the hate of this fake culture that the bourgeoisie represented. Now, World War I actually provided a way for them to release some of this feeling. Quote, the elite went to war with an exultant hope that everything they knew, the whole culture and texture of life, might go down in storms of steel. Now, being in a war didn't mean to be courageous or chivalrous or honorable. In the era of the machines, in the era of mass destruction, all men were cogs in the majestic wheel of slaughter. This feeling of being a cog in the wheel, of being basically subject to forces much larger than you are, was pretty transformative to the totalitarian movements themselves. That this large force that you're subject to is a necessity and is the fate of time, and that you must accept yourself as a cog in the wheel, and that, in a sense, you're yearning for anonymity. Quote, war had been experienced as that mightiest of all mass actions, which obliterated individual differences so that even suffering, which traditionally had marked off individuals through unique unexchangeable destinies, could now be interpreted as an instrument of historical progress. In a sense, war became the Great Equalizer. And according to Arendt, after the First World War, this resulted in an extinguishing of nationalistic feelings. It wasn't about whether you were on the French side or the German side. What mattered was that you were in the trenches. Quote, the anti-humanist, anti-liberal, anti-individualist, and anti-cultural instincts of the front generation, their brilliant and witty praise, violence, power, cruelty, was preceded by the awkward and pompous scientific proofs of the imperialist elite that a struggle of all against all is the law of the universe. That expansion is a psychological necessity before it is a political device, and that man has to behave by such universal laws. In effect, war itself became the authority of values. That cruelty in war was a necessity, that it determined the powerful from the weak. It became the arbiter of truth in the time of nihilism. And according to Arendt, the totalitarian activism during the time after World War I fit very handedly with the perspective of those who were in the trenches in World War I. That what mattered most was action, and only violence could actualize those things, and this was of necessity as a universal law. Post-war activism redefined what it meant to be a person, and it was, you are what you have done. The point was to do something, whether that's heroic or criminal, to do something that was unpredictable, that would be seen. And the terrorism conducted by totalitarian movements fit that very aptly. Quote, terrorism had become a kind of philosophy through which to express frustration, resentment, and blind hatred, a kind of political expressionism which used bombs to express oneself. And according to Arendt, this is what distinguishes the mob from the elite. The mob wanted access to history at the price of destruction. Goebbels is famously quoted in saying, "The greatest happiness that a contemporary can experience today is either to be a genius or to serve one." The elite and the masses, on the other hand, took anonymity seriously. They believed up to a point that genius was non-existent, that what determined a man's character was the deeds that he did. The elite also hated the concept of fame. But despite their differences, according to Arendt, the elite watched with pleasure as the mob destroyed the society that the bourgeoisie had set up. Quote, they had convinced themselves that traditional historiography was a forgery in any case, since it had excluded the underprivileged and oppressed from the memory of mankind. The elite basically took a page out of Marx's book, where you can rewrite history as long as you have a device. For Marx, the device was class struggle. For the elite, it was basically the repression of these mass people. According to Arendt, the alliance between the mob and the elite rested largely on the delight of the elite watching the mob destroy respectability. Destroying respectability, but also rewriting history as they do it. And according to Arendt, Nazism and Bolshevism rewrote history up to a point that they even started rewriting their own sources of their own ideologies. For example, the cause of history wasn't some materialistic dialectic that Marx supposed. Instead, it was a conspiracy of some 300 families that was pulling strings in the background. That they didn't look to the scientific theory of Gobineau against the Jewish people, but instead they forged a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that provided proof for the Jewish secret society. Quote, the object of the constructions was to always reveal official history as a joke, to demonstrate a sphere of secret influences of which the visible, traceable, and known historical reality was only the outward facade erected explicitly to fool the people. And again, the elite loved this because they were living in this kind of pool of nihilism, and thus everything is permissible at this point, as long as one has power. Man can change his past as long as he has the will to do so, as long as they can organize a mass of people that would reinforce the statements as truths. Quote, simple forgeries from the viewpoint of scholarship appeared to receive the sanction of history itself, when the whole marching reality of the movements stood behind them and pretended to draw from them the necessary inspiration for action. This rewriting of history, this reinterpreting of the past, was put into plays at the time, and especially one play that Arendt notes is the Threepenny Play by Brecht. In it, Brecht represents gangsters as respectable businessmen and businessmen as basically gangsters. According to Arendt, this play was received with acclaim on all sides. The bourgeois businessmen in the crowd saw the play as satirical, as something that was kind of true. You know, they were doing pretty sketchy business transactions behind closed doors, and they kind of were entertained by the idea that they were gangsters. And the gangsters in the crowd who watched the play saw this as a literal justification for being a gangster. And according to Arendt, the elite applauded in the crowd because they saw it as witty fun. They enjoyed the idea of turning traditional values upside down. For these elite without strong values, the world was simply a violent playground, and they were happy to be the spectators. According to Arendt, they were very radical, up to the point that what Marx had basically hoped for, some kind of utopia, was not just merely a theory, but something that should be actualized. Quote, the mob and elite found each other so easily because they both sensed that they represented the fate of the time, that they were followed by unending masses, that sooner or later the majority of European peoples might be with them. But according to Arendt, the mob and the elite were mistaken. The mob had hoped that once the masses had gained control of the country, they would put the mob leaders into power. But again, the masses weren't really motivated by any one idea. They really just wanted to continue moving, continue gaining influence amongst not just the country, but everybody in the world. And thus they really had no ambitions to put these mob leaders into power whatsoever. Quote, "For the ruthless machines of domination and extermination, the masses of coordinated Philistines provided much better material and were capable of even greater crimes than so-called professional criminals." In effect, what the masses achieved could be beyond even the dreams of what the mob wanted to do. So much to the point that the few protests that happened while the Nazis rose to power were not conducted by anyone in the masses or anyone in the bourgeoisie, but according to Arendt, they happened with the early members of the mob who started with the totalitarian movements. These mob ambitions were put aside because, again, totalitarian movements don't have any end goal, but they only want to continue moving, and so the mob ambitions really don't fit into that. And according to Arendt, Himmler understood this quite well, and this is why he recruited members who are not part of any kind of mob group, who were motivated by any one goal, but instead were kind of people who really just kept to themselves. Quote, "The masked man whom Himmler organized for the greatest mass crimes ever committed in history bore the features of the Philistine rather than the mob man, and was the bourgeois who in the midst of the ruins of his world worried about nothing so much as his private security, was ready to sacrifice everything on the slightest provocation." This became so much to the effect that the Nazis eventually announced that the only person who is still a private individual in Germany is someone who is asleep. Now, Arendt ends the chapter by having a short kind of paragraph about the elite intellectuals who were sympathizers of the Nazi movement at the time. While she doesn't say it, one might suppose that she is targeting Heidegger, who she had a close, intimate relationship with and who basically supported the Nazi movement. What she says is that these intellectual sympathizers really didn't affect the progression of totalitarianism itself. They really only solidified to the outside world what totalitarianism is and that they should take it seriously. And eventually these intellectual elites were cast aside by the Nazi movement just as much as the people in the mob were cast aside, because the intellectual elite and the mob people basically had some alternative authority that would eventually come into conflict with the authority and legitimacy of the movement. The Nazi movement and the totalitarian movements really only wanted the disinterested Philistine. Quote, "Totalitarianism in power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies, with those of crackpots and fools whose lack of intelligence and creativity is still the best guarantee of their loyalty." That's the end of the chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, it's called The Classless Society. Probably come to you in the next chapter in a week. Have a great day. Thanks.